Good evening. My name is Jan McVarish. I am the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. Welcome to all of those of you who are in the room with us tonight, and also to those who are joining us on the live stream, or indeed if you're watching the recording, which is slightly strange to project into the future, but there you go. So we programmed this event on free speech and the right to protest with a number of contemporary issues in mind. The rights and wrongs of the new style environmental protests was obviously in the news throughout last year, and the government's response to them was much discussed in Parliament later on in the year, notably in the Public Order Bill, which is currently going through the House of Lords. The bill makes provisions for new offences relating to public order, including stop and search powers, serious disruption prevention orders, and deals specifically with protest tactics such as locking onto objects or buildings, tunnelling, obstruction, and interference with infrastructure. And I think we can all sort of speculate as to why that might have come about. However, also included in the bill is section 9, which addresses a quite different issue, a different kind of protest, and that is interference with access to or provision of abortion services. Colloquially, this is known as the issue of buffer zones or censorship zones, as they're known by the other side, if you like, or the two sides on the debate: buffer zones, censorship zones. And the legislation would impose buffer zones around all abortion clinics in England and Wales. So I wanted to focus on this particular aspect of the Public Order Bill and the current discussions about protest and speech, because first of all, I knew that we could get speakers from both sides, and that's really unusual. We often want to organise debates, and it's very, very hard to get people who really disagree who will debate each other. And I knew that Ryan and Anne would debate each other and debate each other well. And they do represent both sides of this debate about the buffer zones or censorship zones, if you like, around the clinics. And B, it's the aspect of the bill which I think seems to relate most closely to freedom of speech. And there's lots of ways in which these proposals have been objected to, which talk about the kind of speech aspects, the conscience aspects, the belief aspects. So I wanted to have a chance to explore those in more detail. But I'll leave it to the speakers to explain the ins and outs of the issue. So first of all, we're going to hear from Ryan Christopher. And Ryan is the director of ADF International in the UK. That's the Alliance for Defending Freedom. Ryan leads the ADF's advocacy efforts and acts as a liaison for politicians, the media, and other NGO allies working on shared mission issues. He also writes on the relationship between philosophy, law, and freedom of expression. ADF is a faith-based organisation that campaigns on many freedom of conscience and belief issues at national and international level. After Ryan will speak Anne Furedi. Anne is the author of The Moral Case for Abortion. Anne ran the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, BPAS, which provides about half of all abortions in Britain, and she ran that for almost 2 decades. She recently completed a master's degree in philosophy, and was awarded an honorary doctorate in science by Kent University for her work on abortion law and ethics. So she knows the subject inside out. And is also a long-standing supporter of freedom of speech. And in fact, I can remember years ago her writing against attempts to ban anti-abortion election advertising. And so she's got a long record of straddling a number of complex positions on this particular issue. We'll then go over to my Free Speech Union colleagues. Tim Crudders first. Tim is one of our caseworkers at the Free Speech Union and spends his time responding to members' free speech issues. Tim's recently retired from a long career in the Metropolitan Police, mostly in counter-terrorism and domestic extremism, including 4 years in the intelligence unit of the Met's Public Order branch. And this involved working on many major public order operations, including the 2010 student riots. Luckily, I was too old for those, so I wasn't there. The 2011 royal wedding, and the 2012 Olympics. He's a strong proponent of free speech within the law, and is an incredibly valuable member of staff for us because he brings a really insightful police perspective to a number of free speech issues. And then we'll go to Bryn Harris. Bryn is our Chief Legal Counsel. He's been Chief Legal Counsel since 2020. He was called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2018, and before that he did a doctorate in classics at the University of Oxford. In previous life, he was a linguist, has worked as a translator and as a lexicographer. His main interests are in law, philosophy and literature, and particularly interested in the law and practice surrounding academic freedom of speech. But Bryn is the person who really is our kind of key decision maker when it comes to how we handle our members' cases and also how we pursue our legislative strategies. So after that, I'm going to give them enough time to explain where they're coming from on this issue and the kind of things they're considering tonight. And then we'll come out to the floor. And if we've got time, we'll try to take a couple of questions from the online Q&A box. I'm hoping that will be possible. But for the online people, do feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat box in the meantime. And I know that's what people normally do. So I'm going to hand the microphone to Ryan. If you don't speak into the mic, people can't hear you at home. So if we can all remember that, would be great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Everyone can hear me okay? Thank you very much. It's quite formidable to debate with Anne in general, but more specifically, if anyone's shared an email exchange with Anne, which I've only done for the first time recently, she has a motto underneath her email signature. What is it, Anne?
Nessun me impune necessit.
And that kind of largely translates to no one crosses me with impunity. So it's an interesting way to be introduced to someone ahead of debating them.
Explain to me, no one messes with me and gets away with it.
But seriously speaking, and one of the things that Jan's already spoken to is your willingness to always have the public conversation on this issue. And I'm really grateful you're willing to this evening, because that's the first thing I'd start with. In my professional career in this area, of all the issues I've worked on that I think is the most widely misunderstood by the vast majority of people, this is the issue. And it really does take some digging down. And I fear that even this evening, and I'm really grateful FSU are covering it at all, we'll have time to cover it in sufficient detail. The first thing I'll begin with is that I think the nature of activity outside of your average abortion facility has been entirely mischaracterized in terms of what happens most of the time. The reality of most presences outside of abortion facilities of the order that we're discussing this evening is usually one or two people very quietly offering literature or help of counseling or charitable services, offering a conversation, and then someone else being nearby to pray for that other person who's offering that. That would be your classic average scenario. And you don't need to rely on my pretty extensive experience with people within the pro-life movement to believe me that the Home Office did an independent review in 2018 into the nature of activities outside of abortion facilities and found that actually it would be disproportionate to pass a national law that blanket banned all activity because the majority of the activities are peaceful and charitable in nature. Do sometimes people do things that aren't ideal? Yes, but of course the heart of the debate is to where you draw the line to prevent those odd happenings. Why do I call them censorship zones rather than buffer zones or safe zones? I think this gets to the heart of my opposition to the particular orders that are in place right now that have created the recent fines and arrests that you might have seen in the media. Simply put, I think censorship zone is the appropriate label to put on these laws and orders because it most accurately describes what novel powers they contain. In the public order laws that we have, in the powers that authorities have, the police, the criminal law as it stands, harassment and abuse is prevented and preventable if we're determined to do that. But what these laws and these powers do that is novel is they provide banishment or censorship of people of a particular worldview or who are trying to do particular things that are connected to that worldview, often religious belief too. I think that's really, really problematic, and I think it's un-British to boot. And you know that an order or law is absurd if it produces absurd results, right? Assuming the police haven't made a mistake. And the absurd results we've seen recently are two people that we've been supporting who have been fined and arrested, respectively, for the contents of their mind. These two individuals were stood still, not bothering anybody, not speaking to anybody, not engaging with anybody, and in both occasions were praying in the privacy of their own mind. On one occasion, that person was searched in the street and arrested, and on another, that person was fined and asked what the content of his mind was. What are you praying about, sir? And when he told the officers that he was praying for his deceased son, he was then fined by the council. Now, if he'd stood there and prayed about Weetabix in his own mind or teddy bears, he wouldn't have been fined. He could have stood there all the same. But what these orders have done is they've enabled, in effect, viewpoint discrimination for the contents of people's minds, literally thought crime for the first time in the history of our country. I think even the Reformation, they didn't get into what were in your private thoughts, and maybe they did, but you know, certainly since then. The one thing I really want people to go away with this evening, if nothing else, there's lots of technical conversation the four of us can have about the law and human rights and where you draw the line. But the thing that's really on my heart to speak to you about this evening, and actually get quite emotional speaking about, is the women who've been whitewashed out of this conversation. And there's a minority of women involved who've had abortions or have kept their children who otherwise wouldn't have without charitable help that the vigils offer, who have been completely ignored and bulldozed on this issue. These women have been preemptively criminalized and prevented from carrying out quiet charitable assistance for other women of the sort that they received themselves and that they knew changed their lives for the better. And if you want to take one headline argument away from what I'm going to say tonight, is it isn't proportionate to completely remove those options from women when it isn't necessary to do so to achieve the stated ends of the council or of the state or of the abortion providers. It isn't necessary to have an absolute us or them approach to that. Lots of women who go for abortions are being coerced. They're being coerced in hard coercion, and they're being coerced through soft coercion too. And I don't find it amusing, as someone in the audience does. It's really, really tragic. I know women who've been coerced into abortions and who wish there'd been somewhere there that they could have spoken to, that they would have trusted, that would have changed their lives. I know women that have kept their children because of the charitable help offered on the gate by quiet, peaceful vigil members who've often been in the same situation themselves. And they say that keeping that child that they always wanted to keep has changed their life for the better. These women, when they've engaged local councils who've been proposing bringing in these censorship zones, have been absolutely ignored from the start. In all the cases I'm aware of, they weren't actively consulted as part of the PSPO. They inserted themselves into the conversation. And when they made their perspective known, they were ignored. In many cases, the council saying, we accept that the services offered that you received will be removed, that there isn't an absolute like-for-like replacement, and we're happy with that, frankly. I find that an extraordinary approach to some of the most vulnerable women in our society, and I don't think it's acceptable. We don't accept it for the homeless community with regards to PSPOs and how they're approached. When PSPOs came in 2015, The Guardian said that they were draconian and unnecessary. There were civil liberty issues for people's ways of life. We saw Liberty, the well-known organization, saying that it would criminalize ways of life, like being homeless in city centers. And there was outcry, and many PSPOs were reversed because there was an acceptance that although people might have issue with homeless people being around for whatever reason, it isn't legitimate to completely sanitize areas of people of a certain way of living and being without good enough reason. I think that should apply here too. In fact, these women that have argued that their options would have been taken away and are arguing that other women's options shouldn't have been taken away have less political clout than the homeless community in this country. It's really interesting to me. They've been absolutely bulldozed. while the intention may be noble, and I think we all share that intention, no one on this panel wants women to be harassed. They certainly don't want women to be distressed. The intention may be noble. There is a very good reason why the tradition of lawmaking in this country and of human rights since the Second World War has been to apply the least restrictive means with regards to fundamental rights, not the most restrictive means to fundamental rights. And what we've seen in the imposition of these orders is the most restrictive means applied first, rather than last, as an attempt to solve an apparent problem. I'll give an example, a practical example. In negotiation with local councils, I know that pro-life groups have said, you can monitor us, put cameras on us, record us, watch us, put council officers nearby, have the police patrolling. There have been offers to put practical, real solutions to any potential harassment on the ground. Those things have never been tried, people. It's never been attempted. There are less restrictive ways of constructing these orders that could have been attempted, but there wasn't an interest in that either. Instead, what we've had is orders constructed that ban, respectively, fundamental freedoms that make up the cornerstones of our democratic way of life and our fundamental freedoms for everyone. And I'll end here, Jan. And those freedoms that have been completely steamrolled in these areas are the freedom to assemble, the freedom to give and receive even accurate information, the freedom of religious practice and prayer, even in your own head, the freedom to protest, if it is a protest, which is actually quite rare. And as we've seen in the case of Isabel recently, even the freedom to think about or pray about the thing that you want to in your own head. It's disproportionate and it's illiberal and it's draconian and it throws a minority of women under the bus. And that's why I stand against it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ryan. Okay, over to you, Anne.
Thank you. It's actually the first time that Ryan and I have had the opportunity to meet, although our colleagues have met many times. And, you know, I would agree with you on a lot of the points that you make, particularly the need to be ever vigilant about the need for laws that are illiberal and draconian and go beyond the point. I have to confess, I regard myself as a free speech absolutist. I don't know if you heard Bret Easton Ellis interviewed on the Today programme this week, where he made the point that he was talking about his new novel, which is the difference between, I suppose, my generation and a lot of the younger generations now. And he was making the point that he simply could not comprehend what hate speech actually was. And I'm inclined to agree with that. I think that there is nothing that is too offensive for people to say. There is nothing that should be beyond the bounds of discussion. But that doesn't mean that we should be in a position to say whatever we like in any circumstances that we find ourselves in, because that's not really a freedom of speech issue. Freedom of speech is really an issue about the putting forward of ideas and debate. It doesn't necessarily mean, to my mind, that your freedom of speech is being curtailed by simply being moved a small distance away. There are lots of things that I can't say in churches, lots of things that I can't say that would be regarded as being antisocial actions were I to do so in the street. And I think we accept that. I'm also, as it happens, you know, I've got a bit of the old protester in me. I was saying earlier that, you know, I've got 3 arrests for public order offences to my name. I've been dragged away by policemen, locked up and pulled back into court, and had to justify on various demonstrations in the past. And I have to say that there was a time, and we were speculating that maybe it was before the Human Rights Act, I don't know, where we kind of sucked up being arrested as part of the gig. You know, that was sort of why you did it. In a way, you were demonstrating your point, you were gaining publicity through it, and that was really the point of the protest. And I think it's worthwhile keeping that in the back of your mind when I'm talking here, because I'm not really talking about closing down protest. You know, people can protest even if a protest's illegal. They have to suck up the consequences of it. And the point that I'm making with regard to protests, or indeed counselling activities or prayer activities outside abortion clinics that interfere and attempt to intervene in what those women are doing when they're attending a medical appointment in a clinic, that has consequences for the people who are going into the clinic and for the people who work in there. So this is not a consequence-free zone. It's not a consequence-free zone. And I think that if you want to put yourself between a person and a conscience-led choice about her own pregnancy, then you take the consequences for doing that. For me, I have to say that freedom of expression and freedom of conscience, those two things, freedom of expression and freedom of conscience, I believe are the most fundamental freedoms that we have. And they should never be diluted. Referral to them should not be taken in vain. Now, second thing I'll say before I get onto the main case of why I don't think there should be protests at abortion clinics is that I'm actually not a big buffer zone fan. You know, I don't actually think buffer zones are a terribly great idea. I actually agree with what Simon Jenkins said. I think it was in The Spectator when he said, actually, the police should just bloody do their job, right? Where there is a social order problem, where there is a public nuisance being created, where people going about their lawful business are being, well, when people are prevented about going through their lawful business, the police should act and end that interference, because in our country, people have the right to go about that business. So why do I think it's wrong, socially unacceptable, and intolerable? And I use that word quite carefully, intolerable, for people to be protesting outside of abortion clinics, whether it's by means of standing outside after you've been told to move on, or whether it's a group of people. I don't think it's a political act. I don't think that you can claim some kind of immunity because you're protesting. I think that what we're doing here is we are interfering with people who are going for a lawful termination of pregnancy. In fact, the protesters are quite open about this. They say their job is not to protest abortion. They say their job is to stop women from ending the pregnancy. Now, that's not a speech issue. You could be having your arguments about abortion. You can be arguing about how wrong it is. You can even argue, although I think you would be utterly making false claims to do so, but you can claim that it is in somehow damaging. You do not have to be standing outside the darn clinic to do it. Somebody argued against me the other day that yes, they do, because it's the last chance that they have to make their arguments to the woman. What I said to that was, well, find ways of making your arguments louder in other areas. This would be like BPAS going to an antenatal clinic and handing out leaflets saying, have you really seriously thought about whether or not you want to have that baby? Have you thought about the consequences that this pregnancy is going to have on you for the rest of your life? Have you thought about the effect that pregnancy is going to have on your body? You know, that would be an absurd, ludicrous and appalling thing to be doing, particularly if you happen to be saying, oh, and by the way, do you know that more women die in the course of pregnancy and childbirth than die in the course of an abortion? So if you're really worried about your health, you should be having an abortion. Do you not think that would be an appalling thing for an organisation to do? Because I do. That is what the form that this takes. So I think it's quite reasonable for clinics to be looking to say that is antisocial activity, it's behaviour likely to cause a breach of the peace, it should not be happening outside of a clinic, and it should end. I have to say, my impulse when this first began to happen was to negotiate with the individuals involved. And I have to say that what my proposal was simply that they might want to move about 50 yards down the road, but the protesters were having absolutely none of it because they said that there they might not be able to reach the individuals who were going into the clinic. So I think that's important. I think it's important to recognise that nobody going into an abortion clinic to receive treatment is doing so to demonstrate their support for abortion. This is not a political forum. Well, you don't demonstrate, women don't have abortions as a demonstration of being pro-choice. In fact, many of the women that we see who have abortions are opposed to abortion in principle. In fact, some of them are, in fact, I do not know a clinic manager actually who hasn't said that at some time they haven't seen a woman who they've seen on a demonstration outside their clinic. They do so because it's in particular circumstances that they need to make that decision. For the groups that say that they're offering counselling and support to women, it is absolutely bunkum. It really is. And Ryan, I just think you are out of your mind and acting in really bad faith. Abortion clinics are inspected by the Care Quality Commission. We have to employ counsellors. We have to employ information on all of the other options. And all you do is scare the living daylights out of them. Stories of one woman climbing out through the window of a clinic in Enfield because she believed it was the only way she could get out of the clinic without terminating the pregnancy, because she'd been told that by the people outside. In fact, had she stayed in the clinic, she would have been able to talk to a counsellor and have all of the signposting into other services. Prayer, really. You know, you talk about this character who, Andrew, who's most recently been picked up for praying outside the clinic in Bournemouth, right? What isn't so discussed is that he organises an anti-choice group in Southampton. Actually, there isn't a buffer zone in Southampton, so he travels an hour to go to Bournemouth on 4 occasions to discuss with the police the circumstances in which he might be arrested, and manages to get himself arrested in very much the same way that I used to do possibly on some of the demonstrations that I was on in the past, to get the publicity and make a point. But let's not be useful idiots and assume that that is anything other than what it is. So what I would say is these protests for me are a problem. They're being protested into disrepute. They actually mean that we end up having discussions like this when we should in fact be fighting for our universal freedoms and standing together and looking at what freedom of expression and freedom of conscience really means. This is not the Reformation. You are not being pressed or burnt at the stake for praying. You're just simply being told that outside an abortion clinic probably isn't the most appropriate venue. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, over to Tim.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. Quite a relief to hear two sides of an argument where they're not throwing bricks at each other and with me standing in the middle. So I want to put a couple of caveats before I start. I'm here. I'm retired from the police. I'm no longer serving, and I'm not here to bash the police, and I'm not here to defend the police. But I hope to be able to give you an idea of what the decisions that the police are making and why they're making them, based on a fair amount of experience. Secondly, caveat is that I'm going to use the term the police. Obviously, you can't. They're not an amorphous body, and you can't make generalizations about the police any more than you can about lawyers, journalists, or anyone else. So just for brevity, I'll use the term the police. But in reality, of course, when you're dealing with for example, the Metropolitan Police Specialist Public Order Unit will have a much more sophisticated approach to policing protests than perhaps in a remote constabulary. Likewise, if you've got a senior officer making a statement about the force's position on protest, it's not always going to marry up with what a constable does on the street when he or she is trying to work out how to navigate through complex legislation to make a decision. So those are the caveats. Jan, I know the time is ticking, so I'm going to make my introduction relatively short and make two very general points. The first point, and it's to correct perhaps an assumption, the right to protest, especially in specialist public order units, is a very high priority for police. The Gold Commander, so each public order or protest event of any size will have a Gold Commander who sets the strategy for that event. Any number of silver commanders and bronzes underneath them, but only one gold, and the gold sets the strategy. In my experience, which includes hundreds of different public order events, number one priority is always the preservation of life and the prevention of injury. Always number one. Number two, strategic priority is always prevent damage to property. And in my experience, number three priority in almost all cases is facilitate the right to protest. Now, there are not many people, I would argue, that would move number three upwards beyond number one and two. Those are immovable priorities for police in protest. I would say perhaps only anarchists and revolutionaries would have a different opinion to most people on that. Maybe some of the students at Bristol University, but might talk about that later on. Only when a protest is short term, it's planned by filling in the forms, and it's permitted by the police, and it's all set up. The police are there to make sure the protest is safe and isn't attacked by its opponents. So in that respect, the priority is there. Only when protests become protracted do the priorities change. If you were starting to get men dragged off tube trains and beaten up on the platform, then the right to protest is going to drop down the scale in comparison to that. If you've got the Shell building covered in graffiti saying all cops are bastards, in full view of television cameras, day after day after day, that is going to affect people's confidence in the police, and that is going to slip in there between number two and number three. When the Extinction Rebellion protests started to rack up, I think it cost £37 million to police that. Once you get that sort of public expenditure pretty much thrown away, then that is going to come in and it's going to knock down the right to protest down the list. That is the reality of the matters. Confidence in the police is going to come in there. Financial considerations are going to come in there. So that's the first thing. The second general point I'd like to make is that much as nature abhors a vacuum, the police hate ambiguity. And I'm talking about police at all ranks. They detest the grey areas that exist in legislation. You might have heard the Met Police Commander, Mark Rowley, he's recently publicly discussed his frustration with the grey areas around serious disruption and how they have to actually wait for serious disruption to occur before they can deal with a protest. That's not acceptable. The public don't want that. The public want serious disruption stopped before it occurs. He's literally tearing his hair out over it. In fact, I think he's bald now. Over the Just Stop Oil stuff and how to deal with it. So my point here is that the more subjectivity there is in the law, the more criticism the police will get for exercising their judgment. If they act decisively, make arrests, then they're agents of the oppressive state. If they act slowly, then they're ineffectual idiots who can't keep order and can't keep the M25 running. This is a default position for most people, actually. No matter what the police do, they have an opinion on what the police are and what the police do based on their political views rather than on the practicalities of the issue, which is just part of the job. You're going to love it. So it's not that the police want more power or less power to act. They just welcome any clarification in the law to make their job more straightforward. Legislation drafters, especially in this legislation that's flying around at the moment, they're not doing the police any favours because they're not looking into the future and making legislation that deals with not just the current problem, but what that problem will become once the protesters have a good read of the legislation and work out how to build scaffolding instead of tunnelling or glue themselves on instead of locking themselves on. They need a bit more thought about the future of when they're drafting legislation. How much time have I got? Because I've got
2 minutes.
Okay, maybe one. I think a general point, and I'm being careful not to give my personal opinions here because I'm here to talk about the police approach. But one point I think Anne's made quite well is that, and I think Bernard Shaw said this, liberty means responsibility, and there'll always be a significant minority who will not show responsibility, and that is where the law must provide that framework of responsibility, and the police are then responsible for interpreting that. This particular issue is quite a niche issue, obviously not for the two of you to whom it's extremely important, but it's more difficult than most for the police to deal with because the activity that's taking place isn't overtly unlawful. And I think one thing I would say in criticism perhaps of some of the publicity recently around the arrest of people for praying, the article or the publicity is very much put forward, you know, it's outrageous to arrest someone for praying or for the thoughts that are in their mind. But that's unfair to the police because they weren't just praying, they were praying in an area where certain activities have been lawfully restricted. And if you don't have the second half of the sentence, it's very misrepresentative. So I will make that point. Jan, I think that's all I want to say at the moment.
That's absolutely fine. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Tim. Over to you, Bryn. You've got an extra minute.
Thank
Nicked
you.
off Tim.
Thank you, Tim. I'll make use of this extra minute. And hello, everybody. I'd like to talk about why I think Clause 9 of the Public Order Bill is flawed. This is the clause that creates the buffer zones. If I have time, I'd like to explain what a better approach to protests outside abortion clinics would be. And I think in some, where I'm sort of landing is that rights talk and the emphasis on human rights is perhaps leading us to conceive of rights as trumps. And it's also perhaps leading us to make culturally sort of value-laden decisions. And perhaps what we really need to be looking at is how to accommodate and negotiate conflicting civil rights, how we essentially do it through a dialogue. I'm just going to, I obviously can't at all aspire to be comprehensive here. Just to very briefly start out by taking the qualified rights of the European Convention on Human Rights. So there are four rights, four articles, 8 to 11, the rights to privacy, freedom of thought and religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. Now, they are all quite similar. They're analogous in that they're all qualified, that there are certain defined circumstances which can justify interference with the right. Now, and the grounds for interference are quite similar between those different rights. But it's nevertheless very clear that despite their analogous nature and despite the fact that the courts say the rights are on equal footing, in law they're not quite equal. For instance, Article 10, the right to freedom of expression, is by far the most heavily qualified right. It's also clear as well that Article 8, the right to privacy, has become an extremely expansive, sort of rampantly growing right, frequently prevailing over the right to freedom of expression. I think it's true as well that there's been uneven development as to when these rights impose positive duties. So Tim, for instance, discussed how police are very aware that there is a positive obligation to facilitate protest. However, there is a sort of, it's far more difficult to establish any positive obligations to secure freedom of speech. So what we're seeing is that there almost is a sort of hierarchy of values between the rights that has implicitly developed as those rights have been considered by the courts. Now, I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think, in fact, I would establish a hierarchy of rights if anyone were foolish enough to let me be in a position to decide. But I think the problem here is that this hasn't been done in a deliberative way. There hasn't been any sort of express debate as to how does our society rank these rights. You know, do we think privacy is more important than free speech? It's happened very incrementally through decisions by courts. I think there's a question as well as to whether legal learning is an effective and a sort of competent way to make these fundamentally moral decisions. So I think there is a problem with the way that there's a hierarchy in our rights. Now, what we're seeing at the moment is Parliament, in a way, taking back control, if I can use obviously, you know, a clearly provocative phrase. And we're seeing that in a number of ways. So we have, for instance, the Bill of Rights Bill, the very inelegantly named Bill of Rights Bill. Now that proposes to give greater weight to freedom of speech in the assessment of convention rights. There was also the Police Courts Sentencing and Crime Act 2022, where Parliament said, well, hang on, look, you know, there are certain sort of harms that protests can cause, and we want that to be grounds for restricting them. And this Parliament did this by sort of setting out criteria where serious disruption can occur. And there's also obviously been Parliament sort of wresting control back from the courts and saying, we are going to say what we think about protest with the Public Order Bill. Now, this is all very good. It's sort of good constitutional dialogue, is the Parliament saying, well, look, the courts have had a really free run here. Perhaps they've gone too far. So now Parliament is going to use its own particular deliberative representative competence to say how the law should be shaped. Very good. The problem is, of course, that the Public Order Bill is a disaster and it's bad, and it's probably worse than anything our courts could come up with. So we're in a bit of a pickle. Before I sort of get into why I think the Public Order Bill is so bad, I just want to take a very quick step back and think about what would a good law of the right to protest, particularly outside abortion clinics, what would it look like? What would we be looking for in such a law? Now, I think, first of all, I think we'd say there are some uncontroversial protections that we would all agree on, things that I would call human rights proper. So, for instance, the arrest of Isabel Vaughan Spruce for internal prayer is very clearly a violation of human rights. It's a violation of the absolute protection of the forum internum, the internal space of the mind. If it's not that, it's clearly a violation of her right to liberty, to stand on a street corner, not bothering anybody. I think there are other examples where I think we can see that the right to protest can infringe human rights. I'm not going to go into them due to lack of time, but I think these sort of human rights, these are very clearly the parameters that the law can prescribe for us. I think it's very clear that we can work within those. Secondly, however, there are some things that the law just can't prescribe for us. So, if, and Tim was describing to me a sort of protest that was regularly outside Tesco's in London somewhere, and that, they came to an agreement that, okay, they'd have 2 hours protesting, 2 hours off, whatever. There was some very elaborate arrangement. Now, obviously, the law can't do that. We're not going to have a statute that says if you want to protest outside Tesco's, you can do it for 2 hours on Tuesday. We're never going to have that. These are the sorts of limitations and rules that we can only reach through negotiation, through the parties involved, trying to resolve their conflicting interests through a process of dialogue. Now, that's already there to a degree in our law. So when Tim was a copper, no doubt he would have acted under Section 14 of the Public Order Act, whereby the police officer on the scene will discuss with the organizers of an assembly what they're going to do and might impose conditions. So, for instance, say, you can protest on this street, but please don't go down this one. Again, that's sort of on-the-spot, very pragmatic dialogue. The Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act 2014, which is the source of the Public Spaces Protection Orders, that also has a dialogic function. It says that local authorities are able to create these protected spaces, PSPOs, but they must do it after consultation with community representatives and the police and others. So it's a dialogue, and the results of the dialogue are enforced by law, as we know. But nevertheless, I think there's a recognition that not everything can be prescribed by law. Some things we have to come to through dialogue and negotiation. Now, my view is that in relation to protests outside abortion clinics, the law probably could, the courts could evolve a series of principles about what would violate privacy and what would be within the right to protest. For instance, in relation to the contents of signs. I mean, that's obviously been, has often been a controversial matter at abortion protests, if they're images of fetuses, for instance. But my position is that we would have better outcomes and better public decision-making if these accommodations, were how users of the clinic can be approached, if they can be accosted, what can be put on signs. I think we would have a much richer and more nuanced public decision-making process if these also, these decisions were made through negotiation and not through the notion of rights as trumps. So really what I'm calling for is that there should be these framing uncontroversial human rights, but then a lot of it in the middle is up for negotiation. It's to be, for people to resolve their essentially competing and equal civil rights. And so as unpopular as the Antisocial Behaviour Act is for some of my fellow panelists, I think that very much sets out the path that we want to be following. And specifically, I think what we need to to do is to move away from this conceit of rights as trumps. Now, what do I mean by rights as trumps? This is a concept of Ronald Dworkin, the idea that, you know, a right is something that trumps other factors or claims in our public decision-making. It's a trump card. And so what is wrong with that? As Nigel Bigger asked recently in the title of his work, what's wrong with rights? Well, there are problems. First of all, it's an extremely adversarial way of looking at the conflict between competing rights. Inevitably, it is ultimately resolved by litigation, in which, of course, one side must win. It therefore frames the debate where we have competing rights, competing interests. It frames it as the search for a knockdown argument, the search for a trump card. I think as well, when we, second point, when we frame this as a matter of human rights, we perhaps reach for a sort of false sense of finality or even sort of sacralization. What's actually a compromise between citizens with equal rights, negotiating, coming to accommodation. When we do that through the courts, through human rights, there's an exaggerated finality, as if we're making some grand moral determination. Third problem, as I said, just going back to what I said at the beginning, when we frame it as a human rights problem, we're already entering into a sort of tilted playing field, because we said the rights already have a certain degree of hierarchical ranking. And so if you're the person pleading free speech, arguably you're already on the back foot compared to the person who's pleading privacy. The fourth problem, and this is the main thing that I want to finish with, is that there's a great danger with rights and adjudication of rights that they can become implicitly laden with other values, cultural values, for instance, and not necessarily legal principles. This can happen partly through the amount of discretion that judges are given in deciding proportionality. It gives them such a large degree that it is possible to make essentially value-based judgments while remaining within the scope of the proportionality test. But if we just take, there's a case of Dolgeriu and Ealing London Borough Council. This was a case considered by the Court of Appeal regarding the legality of public spaces protection orders. I think this is a good example of how rights talk can allow us to misconceive the equality of competing claims between citizens with rights. Now, in that case, the Court of Appeal gave a very emotive account of the importance of privacy of women using the clinic, and I should say a completely valid account. I am absolutely clear that there must be a very strong consideration of the importance of privacy for users of clinics. What the court didn't do, however, is that there was no account of the importance of the pro-life position, which, if put at its strongest, as the right to privacy was, would essentially amount to preventing the intentional killing of defenseless and innocent persons. Now, of course, people reasonably differ, and they say that abortion is no such thing. And in fact, I'm sure there's a lot of people on both sides of this debate. However, if the pro-lifers are right, if they are right that abortion is the intentional killing of defenseless human persons, then you can't get a more urgent matter of public interest. I mean, this isn't just something controversial. On that view, abortion is an extremely important thing which requires our urgent attention and debate. Now, the problem is that we can't know that abortion is essentially a crux. We don't really have a final position on when a fetus becomes a human person and is owed human rights. It is something simply that we have to debate. And so I think what is happening in the courts is that it's possible to outweigh the right to protest about abortion because it's not being weighed at its strongest. And that's perhaps because implicitly judges simply dismiss the claim that it is protesting the intentional killing of the innocent. Or to put it another way, if judges were to take the pro-life claim at its strongest, and that it is, considering the urgent matter of the killing of defenseless innocents, then it would inevitably have much greater weight in the balance between privacy and free speech. Am I right? So I think really we absolutely need to understand that not only is abortion a matter of great personal conviction, not only is it a matter of public interest, it's also the ultimate sort of open question on a matter of the really greatest importance, and we have no option but to debate it and to protect it in the highest way. So I'll sum up now. Now, as I say, I think we have no option but to negotiate, enter into dialogue about these competing rights. That rights as trumps is misleading us into this adversarial idea that essentially one right can trump another. And I think that misrepresents the fact that at these clinics there are two very strongly, very equally matched claims to rights. And the Public Order Bill essentially reflects this rather bullish notion of rights as trumps, this idea that the rights of the clinic users absolutely steamroller over the rights of the protesters. And it's essentially enshrining a cultural bigotry, I think. So I think it's entirely the wrong approach, and really this needs to be a different approach, which is dialogue between citizens with equal but competing rights.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bryn. Okay, I'm very aware that we are not going to be able to explore the rights and wrongs of abortion. That's not the point of this debate. So if we can, and I know for a fact that there are very, very different views in this room. So if you can avoid going down that road, but actually ask direct questions and make your own positions clear on this particular issue about protest and buffer zones, censorship zones, that would be, I'd be very, very pleased about that. It'll make things a lot easier. Okay, Caroline, can I give you this one? If you can not speak until you've got the microphone at your mouth, otherwise nobody at home can hear you. So if right at the very back, Caroline, and then we'll work forwards from there.
Thank you very much. This is a question probably particularly for Anne Furedi, but for all of the speakers. And you said that it's not a political act to, it's not a political act for a woman to go to an abortion clinic. She's going for a lawful abortion. Following that through, I think one would say that it's not a political act to drive your car around along a motorway. And yet you might encounter an Extinction Rebellion protest. And the thing that strikes me as odd in the way we manage this is that someone who commits what is, on the existing law, explicitly a criminal offence of obstructing the highway is given a very permissive treatment by the police, and someone who silently stands near an abortion clinic is given a much more restrictive, they are policed against much more vigorously, if I can put it in that way. Do you, and this is, say, for Anne, but for all, perhaps all of the panel, think that that can be reconciled in an intellectually consistent way? It seems to me that it can't. It seems to me that it is quite explicitly the case that one mode of protest is privileged and another one is not. But I would invite your response to that and that of the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just take one more question, then we'll just come back to the panel. Yes, John.
And you said that you weren't a big fan of buffer zones and that you just wanted the police to do their job. And I don't think that's really a correct characterization of your argument, because I've read what you wrote in Spiked. in December, where you make it quite clear that you don't think there should be any sort of protest allowed. Yeah, you're nodding now. There shouldn't be any sort of protest allowed outside of buffer zone, outside of abortion clinics. And for example, you cite the example which you described as particularly cruel of two women who gave a knitted baby booty to a woman who was going to have an abortion. Now, whatever you think of that particular act, it was just an act of protest, political protest. It was something that was done by people out of a deep moral standpoint, quite possibly religious, but it doesn't matter. The point is, if we are going to be a free society, we surely have to tolerate those kinds of acts, because that was simply an argument by imagery. And if you endorse buffer zones on the basis that you do endorse them, you are opening up the door to the criminalisation not just of this particular act with regards to abortion, but with regards to plenty of other things that will come and hit us down the line. And I can foresee very dangerous consequences as a result of opening up this door.
Okay, thank you. Let Anne have a chance to reply.
Yeah, on both of those points, I actually really agree with the guy at the back. I do think that they've been dealt with quite differently, and I actually think that the Extinction Rebellion protesters should have been. I actually think that proportionately, they've actually created a far greater harm, actually, than has probably been created by this relatively smaller number of protesters at abortion clinics. And I think that, again, it comes down to the fact that that is profoundly antisocial behaviour. And we have to think about what it means in terms of political protest. My own view is that I think that somehow there is something about society at the moment that basically means the nature of certain kinds of protests has really changed. It's all about me. It's all about I don't think this should be happening, so I'm going to do whatever I want, regardless of the impact that it has on anybody else. And I think that there's something about society today that does that. And I think that, you know, the police would be well within the bounds of what most people in this country want the police to do to deal with them. Look, this point about, I did use that example of women handing out baby booties to women coming into an abortion clinic as a particularly cruel, really cruel act of demonstrating what was going to go on there. I didn't argue, and I didn't actually present that as an argument for buffer zones. I presented it as an example of how these how these actions, let's just call them actions, can have a profound and deep impact on patients who are accessing a building because they are presenting for treatment and should not be expected to have to deal with that as they are going into a particular clinic. And I just think it's almost unimaginable to me that anyone would want to behave like that, except if, as you know, my colleague's saying, if we were talking about abortion, we could have a different discussion about it. And if people do think that women going into abortion clinics are committing murder, you know, if we really are, as I've been accused of in the past, you know, running baby extermination mills, then don't tell me you just stand outside and hand out baby booties. You'd be burning the ruddy clinics down. You know, if you genuinely believe that, if people genuinely believe that, but they don't. And what this is it's kind of grandstanding. I think that for me, the ideal solution to all of this is negotiation. You know, but at the same time, there can be no negotiation on people interfering with the lawful right of women to obtain a form of medical procedure that it was actually specifically made possible to them by an act of parliament. It's not an equal playing field. It's woman going into clinic to get a medical operation that Parliament decided that she could have, and a bunch of people who think it's wrong, so they're just going to do their thing and stop her from doing it. Not equal.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, fairly quick, and then we'll come back out because I'm sure there'll be questions for you.
Yeah, I just want to touch on sometimes it very much you can characterize, I think, that what happens outside an abortion facility is protest. And even on those grounds, I do think we've got the balance wrong. So I'm going to be open about that. But actually, just to pick up what Anne was saying, I can't imagine why anyone would ever want to be there. And, you know, Anne knows that it's extremely rare, if ever happened, that people are actually blocked from entering in any significant way. That isn't what's ever been going on. The reason and the reason people want to be there, again, is we're not listening to the women who are telling us why they want to be there, because in their experience, so what? I think we should listen to their experience, and I think that's so what? Because they were in a situation where there was soft or hard coercion, in a situation where they knew that their previous experience in a clinic had been that they were on a conveyor belt. That's their experience. And they want to quietly offer the opportunity for other women who might be in that situation to have the same opportunity to have a life-changing moment in a way that they don't think they'll get in any other manner. That isn't primarily protest. And the real test of whether these orders or these laws are proportionate is to ask, do you think you should criminalize that woman doing that thing for those reasons in that way? And I think the answer is no. So whilst protest should be at the heart of this conversation, I just want to bring it back that most of the time, this absolutely is not protest.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, yes, in the red cardigan.
Before last Friday, I was in Bond Street, and it was 6:30 in the evening, a few people, and there was a protest, an animal activist protest in front of Max Mara, saying, stop using crocodile for your bags. And there were like 30 of them in front of the door. And I was thinking, I couldn't leave, the people I was with, but I really wanted to go there and see what would they have done. And I really genuinely think that we should discuss what is a protest, because, I don't think that a group of people shouting at me if I want to enter in a shop would be a protest. Or what about tomorrow? Now meat is off the menu, so we will have people, in front of restaurants telling us not to enter in the restaurants. And I see that really we need to see that, and really we need to think how we classify a protest. I don't think that me going to have a medical procedure by myself, being told by a group of people, is really an acceptable type of protest. I will not have any means to defend myself. If I went to Max Mara, I will have not means to defend myself. I think that a protest is a group, an institution against an institution, an idea against an idea, but of big blocks, not me in my private capacity. So really, I urge to, for us to really see and rediscuss the meaning. Also because, we everything can be rediscussed. We have not to apply to laws that have been there forever. We are a young society.
I love the fact that the Italian woman speaks about the buying of designer handbags and going into restaurants. Yes, over here, Caroline. Thank you.
Thanks. I agree with that. And Anne, in her comments, used the term useful idiots. And I suppose one of the things I find most worrying about the discussion that's going on around abortion clinics and this claim that this has got something to do with censorship and free speech is just the utter confusion and lack of clarity amongst people who should know better about what free speech is and what debate is and what matters about it. You know, I've spent most of my adult life at university doing everything I possibly can to open up debate, including on this issue. And it's absolutely essential, and there needs to be an awful lot more of it. And I'm completely opposed to all of the efforts that are being made by student unions and various other bodies to shut down debates about abortion and stop people who are opposed to abortion arguing what they think. That is about freedom of speech. Going up to a woman who is approaching a clinic and trying to get inside her mind has got absolutely nothing to do with free speech. It's just harassing a woman. That's all it is. And if people can't see the difference between those two things, who say that they're defenders of free speech, well, that really, really worries me, because these are entirely different things. One is an essential component of what we need in a democratic society. The other is a kind of degenerate spasm being pursued by a movement which is always completely chameleon. I mean, the anti-abortion movement, you never know what they're saying, one thing one day, one thing the other. And it's basically, this is only happening, and these stunts going on outside clinics now, they're only happening because you've lost the argument. And that's why I was laughing at you earlier.
Okay.
You've lost the argument, and you need to get in public and have the argument and leave women alone outside clinics.
Okay.
None of your business. Leave them alone.
Thanks, Ellie. Okay, chap down here.
Anne, I'd like to start with your definition of abortion in this. This dropped onto my...
Are you going to
door.
focus on the protest?
I
issue
will
then?
do, yeah. Your definition of abortion is the intentional destruction of the fetus in the womb or any untimely delivery brought about with intent to cause the death of the fetus. Now that is bang to rights 100% attempted murder in law. Now, that brings me to what buffer zones do. The purpose of buffer zones is to protect abortion clinic staff as they go about their business of statutory attempted murder, aiding, abetting and counselling abortion, which the Abortion Act has never made legal, and contrary to the International Criminal Court Act 2001, the crime against humanity of murder, extermination and forced abortion. Now, hang on, bear with me. Last November, the European Court of Human Rights referenced the Nuremberg Military Tribunal that declared abortion to be a crime against humanity. And you obviously remember that I told you 6 years ago. Yeah, I told you that it would... That, yeah, I told... Who... No, hang on. I told you that the Nuremberg...
Are you going to focus on this particular issue? Because I'm going to pass the microphone on otherwise.
I told you that the tribunal that back at Nuremberg would have sent you to the gallows, but we'll pass on that. How on earth is the imposition and the enforcement of these buffer zones not in itself good enough to send police officers to The Hague?
Thank you. And then the lady here. Okay. Fine. In that case, let's. What time is it? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's take some more. Yeah. Well, it's going to go very fast. Get Toby, and then we'll come back over this side.
Thanks, Jan. Very good discussion. I wanted to make a similar point to the point being made by the two Johns, I think, which I'm not sure you've quite answered, Anne. I mean, I haven't made up my own mind about this issue, and the FSU doesn't have a position on it. But one thing that does trouble me about this particular law is that it makes the presence of people with particular beliefs unlawful in just one particular area, one particular place. You suggested it would be ridiculous if people with the opposite view to the anti-abortion protesters, protested outside an antenatal clinic and tried to dissuade women from having babies. But that's not, as I understand it, against the law. Ditto, John, you made the point that it's a slippery slope. And if we're going to make it unlawful for people to protest or even express their disapproval of what's going on in other ways, then it opens the door to it being done elsewhere. But in a way, that would make it less discriminatory. So if it was unlawful, for instance, to protest outside Maximara and try and stop people wanting to purchase crocodile handbags from doing so, or if it was unlawful to protest outside restaurants serving meat, then in a sense this law would be less objectionable because it wouldn't be discriminating against one particular set of people with a particular set of beliefs. That's my problem with it. It seems to be discriminatory. It seems to be singling out one particular group and saying, no, if you have these particular beliefs, you can't express them within a 150-yard radius of this particular facility. And that just does seem to be discriminatory.
Isn't it the case that it would cover if pro-choicers also tried to act outside clinics? I think they would be covered. From my reading of this, they would also be covered.
What, even outside antenatal clinics?
No, outside abortion clinics. So if the pro-choicers decided to counter-protest, that would also be covered.
But it's so odd, isn't it, that we want to police protests in just this particular area, and there hasn't been an overwhelming. There's no overwhelming public sentiment, I think, that the right to privacy should trump the right to freedom of expression or outside these particular areas. There hasn't been a kind of, there's no sort of overwhelming feeling. It's almost as though because people with anti-abortion views are an unfashionable minority, it's okay to restrict their rights in a way we wouldn't for other people with more fashionable views who wanted to protest.
Okay, I'll let Anne and Ryan answer that.
Well, I think the reason why it's targeted against the unfashionable minority is because actually they're the only people at the moment who have been trying to impede patients accessing lawful treatments. I think that, my concern, it's interesting that a lot of people were concerned about the public order bill maybe setting precedents. And I agree with you that I think it's just a mess. I think all public order bills are an absolute total mess. My concern is that, imagine the situation. I'm going for a hip operation in 2 days' time. I'm having private healthcare treatment. Imagine if a bunch of Keep Our NHS Free or whatever it is decided that they were going to protest outside of the clinic and were trying to stop me on my way in, telling me that I was unlikely to come out of the operation safely, that they were employing, telling me wrongly that they were employing unqualified anaesthetists, I'm already bloody nervous, frankly, about having the operation. This is not a good time where I want to debate the freedom of the NHS. So I do think that it's impossible to have good laws that police this degree of nuance in access to medical care. And I think that, in fact, rather than, to my mind, the only way we are going to resolve it is not so much through clever drafting of legislation. John, I think you're right about that. You can't draft it like that. It's more of a public discussion about what is good behavior, what are good protests, what are good ways of demonstrating that we're against somewhere. Because I honestly think in any civilized society, in any society that really respected freedom of conscience, you would not have people protesting outside abortion clinics. You just wouldn't. And I think that's the public discussion that we need to be having.
Thanks, Anne. Ryan.
Yeah. Just respond to that a little bit. Freedom of conscience obviously needs to go both ways. Pro-lifers seem to not be able to protest enough and are yet blocked from protesting all at the same time in this discussion. So I've actually had that charge at the pub for my friends. Like, if you really believe innocent people are being killed, why aren't you burning the clinics down? And yet, if people did, then we know how that would go. So it's a pretty tough spot to be in, I think, to have that pro-life view. I think there's a lot of conflation about what activities actually constitute harassment or not. I think that was representative in the point made by the lady here, and that this isn't really actually about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is some kind of, I don't know, ruse to hide the fact that people are looking to harass or block. I'd say freedom of speech isn't the beating heart. It is very relevant. And I think freedom of speech is at threat with a precedent that these orders set. And I think they are discriminatory in practice, Toby, as well. But I think the beating heart in terms of fundamental rights in play here is about the exchange of information, which is another fundamental right very much attached to speech. So it's bad enough when the state decides on behalf of my friend Jenny that she can or cannot receive information that it perceives to be disinformation or misinformation. That's dangerous enough a precedent. But when the state or a local council starts banning accurate information being given to Jenny, when Jenny wants to receive that information in an exchange that in any other reasonable sense of the word wouldn't be harassing or abusive in any way, then I think that's incredibly patronizing and a really dangerous path for us to go down all at the same time. And it's really interesting to me that in this discussion, one side is saying women should access accurate information or help that they might actually need only this way. They can't do it in that way, only in this way, which is to ignore the experience of an albeit significant minority of women who are trying to say, don't whitewash us out of this discussion. So saying that services are regulated or they're official doesn't cut it, I'm afraid, guys. The CQC has found in the last decade, the regulator of abortion providers, that abortion providers have pressurized women into having abortions because staff have been told that they'll get bonuses or they'll lose their jobs if they don't send women down. I know not under your watch, you'd say, Anne, but what I'm saying is, like, it isn't fair, and I don't think it's accurate of your general philosophy of life that women should be dictated to, that you can only get information from these people in that way if it's something that they want to receive in that way too.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, can you be quite quick?
Yeah. Just to the lady with the red cardigan, sort of, asking if I go to Tesco and people are telling me not to eat meat, is that protest? I certainly think it's not really interference. Really, it's not an intolerable interference with your day-to-day life. And it was very interesting that Anne used the same wording as the Public Order Bill when she referred to protest interfering with users of clinics. And part of the problem with the bill, and perhaps with this wider argument, is that it gives an exorbitant scope to the meaning of what interference with somebody is. And I mean, Ellie, I don't think getting into other people's minds, which when you phrase it like that does sound terribly insidious, but essentially is the basis of our democratic civic society. I think it's an extremely exorbitant definition of interference with people if we say that trying to persuade somebody, seeking to persuade somebody, again, that is outlawed by the Public Order Bill, to say that that's interference. Now, I think we do need to say that there is a much lower bar for harassment outside abortion clinics, that conduct that in other circumstances wouldn't be intrusive or harassing would be at an abortion clinic. I think that's absolutely right. But I don't think we can say that there is this exorbitant protection such that we achieve essentially the privatization of public space. And I think public space, we can debate the most pressing and difficult moral questions of our age.
Tim.
The beautiful thing about working for FSU is you can disagree with your colleagues at will. I don't know, Bryn, I think if you're trying to buy a fur coat or you're trying to buy anything from Max Mara or wherever, and you're getting screamed at for 2 hours on a Monday, as per agreed by the police for a time-limited protest, that isn't an imposition of your rights, but it is an imposition on the rights of the people running the shop and of the customers using it. If that protest is there all day, every day, of the week, which it has been outside Harrods for quite some time. So, and I just wanted to add to the thing about what we've got to decide what protest is. I think that's very important. I do not see, this is my personal opinion now, not a police opinion, I do not see that there's a continuum from free speech to protest. I think they're completely different things. I think free speech is right on the left-hand side of the continuum, and there's a huge gap before you start talking about lawful protest. Lawful protest is the police find it very easy to deal with. And then right at the end, you've got your unlawful protest, which is also very easy to deal with. It's violence, it's extremism, it's clear cut. In the middle between those two, lawful and unlawful, is this direct action, it's called. Direct action is the nightmare for police. And that's where this legislation is responding, not to the police wanting more power. That's nonsense. The police, the legislation is responding to the public who are screaming out for this seriously disruptive Extinction Rebellion type protest, that's Just Stop Oil type protest, screaming out for it to be dealt with properly, and the police haven't been dealing with it properly. Half of it's their fault, I'll give you that, but half of it's the fault of the legislation. So it's not about police making a decision to police one thing one way and another thing in a different way. The police respond to the public, and the public get the law changed through their democratic processes, as is what's happening now.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, where's Caroline? Could we go over this side? And if we start on the lady with the long dark hair.
Another question for Anne, I'm afraid. So you mentioned that freedom of speech encompasses all arguments and nothing is too insulting. So my question would be, in terms of that, how does that differ from the fact that it's being outside a clinic, holding no weight over it being a palpable display of freedom of speech inherently? I feel like this is very much one rule to silence a specific group of people.
Could you just hold the microphone?
Yeah, of course. Just because it's a minority opinion, as it's a minority opinion, it does not make it any less valid or mean that people cannot express themselves freely in those ways. Meanwhile, we have no one batting an eyelid over throwing oil over paintings in the National Portrait Gallery, Extinction Rebellion stopping people getting to work and school. As we've stated before, no one is stopping those people coming into the clinic. There isn't a space where we can section off and say this cannot be a protest if we're doing it here. Not protesting in order to shame or make people feel guilty as well is a good point. Is to get their life experiences across and stop other women making from something that they statistically usually regret or experience trauma from. 15% of women in the UK have experienced coercion, and it's not talked about enough. And that is not coming from a place to shame them or to change their minds. It is to share their lived experiences.
Okay.
So, sorry, I'm just finishing. So why is that this form of protest is less valid and accepted than protesting in any other location or context?
Okay, thank you. If you could just pass the microphone along the row, Caroline, to my husband.
Thank you very much. So I think, Ryan is right to ask us to be vigilant, obviously, about limitations on freedom of speech and freedom of expression and all these different categories. And John's right, there is a slippery slope that we have to be wary of. But I think there's another slippery slope that I find doesn't seem to get mentioned here, which is the denigration of democracy and denigration of politics. Because what underpins a lot of these actions, whether you're talking about Extinction Rebellion or the buffer zones, is this idea that, well, we've exhausted all other possibilities. We tried everything else, and this is what we have to do. They're effectively saying the political sphere is not the place to be if you want to change anything. And that's patently not true. I mean, this gentleman here, quotes all these things. But if you want to campaign against abortion, you can campaign against abortion. You can stand candidates in Parliament. You can stand for local election. If you think that oil is not the future of the world, you can stand for Parliament. You can write books. There is no freedom of speech that is being curtailed in any of these discussions. And I feel like if we give ground to that, we effectively go along with the idea that they are actually, or these people are actually, in the terrain of freedom of speech, then we've effectively agreed with them that the sphere of politics is not the place to be and not the place to have these arguments. Bryn, you talked in your opening remarks about we need to debate and we need to discuss and we need to find a way to do it. You know, but not outside a clinic. We've got spheres to do these things. We've got parliament, we've got books, we've got libraries, we've got all these, we spent centuries building these things. You know, let's use these to have these debates.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Thank you.
I think that this is I think this debate is about the breakdown between public and private, and the public and the private and the personal spheres, and it reminds me of the way that today Harry has just bared all in his book. Children send nude photographs of themselves to strangers. Trans activists try to get men allowed into women-only spaces. And I think that this is a loophole, or this is an area of society that the buffer zone is an example of it, and it's a very kind of difficult area. And I think that the anti-abortion protesters are basically, it's a bit like, I imagine this as being a bit like being followed into the women's loos and having them argue with you over the top of the cubicle. Because I think that when you're going into somewhere to have an abortion, it's not like going to get your teeth done, right? It's actually something that only happens to women. It's a bit embarrassing for a lot of us. And it's not actually your house you're going into, but it's a semi-private space. And the area around an abortion clinic, I think, is what Anne is saying that's what's special about this. Just briefly, what I don't understand is, A, why don't the police do their job? I think you on the left, I think you're being a bit disingenuous. I think, or else, I do think the police leadership has been taken over by the woke brigade. I see no reason why Just Stop Oil protesters cannot be just left glued to those gantries, right? I don't see why you can't just pull people off the roads. And I agree with Anne that it should be about negotiation. But I don't understand why this negotiation has failed. I do not understand why it's managed to get to that point. If it's simply because people like Ryan are being really unreasonable and refuse to debate, but you seem very ready to debate, Ryan. So I'm not quite sure what the problem is.
Thank you.
Otherwise, I think it's about public and private and how that's being broken down.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to take, if the microphone could just go to TJ over here in the middle. Is there a question from the Q&A that you could ask?
That's great. Actually, there's a short comment and a question. It seems to me that the speakers have highlighted well the specific problems. The last speaker called for nuance, while the former police officer says the police need simple certainty. These two cannot be held in tension together satisfactorily. So the problem is how to develop a middle ground of sorts, which is just what we're talking about. And a question, what is serious disruption? Given that fracking companies have sought ex parte injunctions upheld by police forces, who determines what this disruption is?
Great, thank you very much. So we're going to take a couple more from the room and then we'll come finally back to the panel just to round up. Yes, the lady with the red glasses behind.
I was wanting to know whether anybody is entitled to actually ask you what's inside your head, what you think. Because if you're not doing something specific, you can only judge people by their actions. And also, if you ask people what they think, how do you know that they're telling the truth?
Thank you. I think most people will be incredibly sympathetic to any woman going to an abortion clinic. I think the problem is we're trying to mitigate against unpleasantness. And there's lots of unpleasantness in the world. And if you create a law to stop people saying unpleasant things to people when they're going into a place they don't want unpleasant things said to them, people are worried it's going to make a precedent that could spill out into other areas. And I think it's about nuance. And if there's a mild protest outside a clinic with someone gently trying to put their point of view across, I think that's okay. But if someone's doing a lot of hassle to a lady, it's totally unacceptable. And probably the existing laws we've got in place are sufficient to mitigate for that. And it won't be happening all over the country. It'll be happening in a small number of clinics rather than in every clinic. I don't know, but I'm assuming that. So I think we've got to be very careful about creating new laws and creating buffer zones in case they spill out into other areas of life that are important and we wish to protect.
Thank you very much. Okay, right, it's 9:10. We need to finish at 9:15. So I'm going to come back to the whole panel. So I'm going to start with Ryan.
Yeah, fair bit to reply to there. I'll try and be really brief, Jan. Yeah, final remarks, but I will make them responsive rather than just grand final remarks that I'm not capable of. Particularly difficult, I think a few people have touched on, if you want to have a political protest and make a political point, do that through more mainstream political means. Yeah, 100%. I agree with that for the most part. But here's the thing. If you actually speak to a lot of the women that offer help to other women, which again is 99.9% of what happens in these places, and this is what's been now criminalized, what they're doing is a response to what women have said they found useful or that they found useful themselves, which is that I wouldn't have known that this opportunity was available to me if you hadn't been there and hadn't presented yourself in a peaceful, friendly manner in the way that you did. So this isn't usually about making a political point. Right? That's the main thing to say. Second thing is, it's then said, well, if there's any manner of not agreeing with what's happening in the facilities, then that's a kind of protest. And protest outside a facility is always unacceptable because it risks distressing or upsetting women going in. And I want to repeat, no one wants that for its own sake, nobody. But there is a really significant precedent being set if we take that as our threshold. For any kind of public discourse, because I don't see, I've had a lot of experience of women who've had abortions, and, there's distress that goes on for a long time in many circumstances after an abortion. Let's not pretend that this is just about that day or the day after. I know women who've dreamt about what happened to them weekly for 20 years. What's the point? The point is, if the distress threshold or upset threshold is what dictates what political conversation we can have and where, then we need to frankly ban pro-life speech from the whole of public space if it's about minimizing distress. I think it's a really dangerous precedent that that's a threshold that we use for these purposes. And lastly, I do think we should judge people by their actions. It's a really important principle of our long-standing criminal law and human rights precedent that, you should be criminalized for what you actually do, not what you think, not what you believe, but what you actually do. If someone harasses, they should be treated as a harasser, but we shouldn't be preemptively criminalizing people that there's no proof of that happening to. So that's where I'll leave it for this evening.
Great, thanks, Ryan.
Just a few points on the issue of distress and so on. I just think that you have to bear in mind that it's not just distress or upsetting someone. I agree we can't be protected against that, but it's distressing someone who is just about to undergo a medical procedure where really you want her to be as calm and as relaxed and as undistressed as it's possible to be, don't we, all of us, right? So that's the point. The point about, it's interesting, Ryan, you keep making this point about women who want to offer other women their advice. It's kind of what I mean when I say it's a bit all about them. They want to offer this advice regardless of whether the women actually want to receive it. And as you correctly say, there may be a very small minority who want it. But the point about all of those consultations was the overwhelming majority didn't want it and didn't want people there offering it. Now, when we had a clinic at Bedford Square in London, it actually worked great because there was a big open square outside of the clinic. And what happened was that we would continually have actions by people that would be about 150 feet away from the clinic entrance, and people could offer their leaflets, so people coming to the clinic would see them, they'd have the banners, they'd have the aborted fetus posters and so on. If people wanted to go over and talk to them, it was absolutely fine. If people wanted to come into the clinic without being interfered with, that was absolutely fine. Don't have any problem with people handing out leaflets, showing things, doing what they want, as long as it doesn't impinge on people who don't want anything to do with them. And so I actually think that's kind of the halfway house thing. Do your protesting, hand out your leaflets, do your counselling, just do it away from the darn clinic entrance and everybody will be quite okay with it. Well, I would be okay with that. The thing that I just want to say finally, I have got so much sympathy actually with the woman who spoke over there, who made the point about how it is today deeply unfashionable to be religious. The anti-choice protesters are an easy target. You know, the Guardianista look down their noses. You know, these religious people who believe in invisible things and don't follow the scientific evidence. They're very snooty about having a discussion on this or recognizing the viewpoint of people who are anti-abortion. You know, I've had it put, I shouldn't be debating with you because abortion should be seen as being beyond debate. It's a matter of fact. It should simply be regarded as a matter of healthcare. That is completely wrong. And I think that it is appalling that there is this atmosphere of complete dismissal. But I think that the way that we are going to need to resolve this, and I agree, it's a moral question, actually, that is never going to be resolved by legal technicalities. And it should be one that it's still possible to debate in society. And the problem is that anything which creates limits around speech, it shuts that down. So instead of trying to push people into positions where that's happening, we should be, in fact, I think, trying to look for more openness and more engagement, and particularly where young people are who are not pregnant and seeking abortion. So let's see the campaigns move into the universities and onto the streets and into the media. That's where we can have a debate about it without impacting on people seeking care.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, over to Tim.
Thanks, Jan. I thought that was a great question from the observers on the internet. That at the same time as we're arguing for nuance and agreement and negotiation, the police are arguing for clarity and it needs to be black and white. That's just the nature of the beast. And I repeat the phrase earlier about liberty means responsibility. It'd be great if everyone had that sense of responsibility and acted in a civil manner, but it doesn't work that way. So the law and the police are there to provide that framework of responsibility, and it's not an easy job. It's almost an impossible job. The serious disruption question, that's the issue. That's the nub of the issue. The bottom line is that serious disruption, in order to be dealt with, had to actually be happening rather than be predicted, and that is the problem that the new bill seeks to sort out. In addition to that, there was a Supreme Court judgment, which is Ziegler, if you want to look it up, if you've got a quiet night ahead. The Ziegler judgment at the Supreme Court made it even more difficult, and it basically brought principles of Human Rights Act into decision-making for police officers. And what's more, the Ziegler judgment made it important for police to consider the importance of the cause and the sincerity of the protesters. That is a completely political issue. That's nothing to do with the police. So, and to suggest that the police can make those political judgments is not reasonable. So, in answer to those two problems, what is serious disruption and the Ziegler issue, the new bill has created this offences involving works and infrastructure. So basically, to get over the serious disruption thing, they just said don't muck about with the roads and the trains. But it's not a great piece of legislation, but it makes it easier for police if that's an important issue.
Thank you. It's very positive that a number of people were emphasising the importance of negotiation as a means of coming to a good outcome here. I absolutely agree with Anne that we need to be looking at how to protest well, and that's perhaps a more important and a more nuanced question than how to protest lawfully. I would say perhaps against Anne that the right to protest and indeed the right to express oneself is only really meaningful if we have the right to protest effectively. That is to say, by making our point as persuasively as we can. And it's for that reason, I think, that people insist on their freedom to protest outside abortion clinics. I think without that addition to the right, it amounts to nothing more than the right to vent. And I'm not sure that that's really as valuable a right as the right to efficacious protest. One thing I want to say, and again, this actually shadows what Anne said, is that law, legislation will not answer for us the moral questions posed by abortion. Law will draw a line in the sand for us, and it will give us a degree of artificial certainty and clarity about what our rights and our obligations are. But there's a fundamental difference between law and morality, that you can't draft a law and impose a law and say, therefore, what was immoral yesterday is moral today, and that's not how morality works. So there's not going to be any act of parliament or any tablets of stone that's going to solve this problem for us as to when a human fetus becomes, in moral terms, a person. We're just going to have to rub along and try and have this argument as best as we can. I think that means both sides take each other's position at its strongest, that they seek common ground where it is, and that they try to narrow the issues rather than to exaggerate them as some sort of cultural chasm. And I think it's absolutely right, isn't it, that although one mustn't insinuate too much, one can't help but notice that being pro-life is non-you, low status, and being protesting against climate change is very much you and high status. And it's hard to avoid the suspicion that that perhaps does motivate some of our public decision making. But because we have no other option but to talk this out and to find a resolution, I think it's clear that any moves to try to silence the opposition are likely in the long run just to aggravate this and to make this a far more unpleasant debate than it needs to be.
Fab. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Really, really appreciate you putting the time in to prepare for it and also to come and actually have the debate, and also to you in the room conducting an exemplary debate on something that's obviously very controversial and very sensitive. So that's it's fantastic. And also for the people at home, just to say that, I sound like a television presenter, we'll be on tour. The Free Speech Union is going on tour. We were in Cardiff last week. Bryn was there as well. This week we are going to Manchester on Wednesday and Edinburgh on Thursday, and then we roll on around the country after that. So if you haven't already been to our events page on our website and signed up for one of those regional speakeasies, please do that. Secondly, Toby, what's the latest on our Clarkson petition? What are we at? Okay, so we have a petition on the go on change.org in defence of Jeremy Clarkson retaining his job with ITV. So if you'd like to sign that, please add your name and spread that around. Thank you very much for coming, and good night to everybody at home.